Canada in the crosshairs of geopolitics. Rare metals war. Hi, I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science Society, and today I'd like to talk with you about a kind of complicated geopolitical struggle that I think is going on in Canada, and I don't think that many people are aware of what's going on or what the implications might be. I've got quite a few slides, so it might be a rather long presentation. I do have a lot of maps, so we'll go through those rather quickly, but you might want to pause and have a coffee as we go along and come back to it. So let's have a look at the rare metals war and what that means for us. So these are some of the reference books that I can suggest to people to read to see where I've drawn these insights. So how climate ideology and geopolitics threaten Canada. Well, it's a messy mix of things. There's a blend of geopolitics. There's the Indigenous land back movement. There's transnational progressives, green crony corporatism, eco-fascism, the tar sands campaign, anarchists and anti-capitalists, and the self-declared genocidal state of Canada. What do I mean by that? I'll show you. So first, let's go back to 1989 and Bill McKibbon's book. Bill McKibben is with the organization called 350.org, which is the intended target he wants for carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. But this was his pastoral view of the future, a future free of consumerism or material ambition. Americans would rarely travel, experiencing the world instead via the internet, grow much of their own food, power their communities through solar and wind, divert their wealth to developing countries, and only under these transformational conditions, argued McKibben, would we be able to set a moral example for countries like China to change course, all in the hope that these countries will accept a grand bargain toward a cleaner energy path. And that's in work by Matthew Nisbet from 2013. Now, in the late 1990s, Elaine Dewer wrote this very well-researched book called Cloak of Green, and she was invited to go to an Amazon rainforest event one evening, and she was very surprised to see all these corporate guys and government people roaming around with these environmentalists. And after intensive research, she decided that most concerned citizens trust environmental groups to fight on behalf of the public for sensible solutions to the world's most pressing problems. But Elaine Dewer discovered that this trust is often misplaced. She discovers some disturbing revelations about these groups and their relations to green corporations and government. Cloak of Green is a penetrating investigative study that challenges many established pieties of the environmental movement. Now, it's hard to get these days, but you can probably read some of it online. Now, what's important for you to understand is that Canada is a land of riches. This is a map from 1927, but look at all the different riches that are laid out across the land. Everything from timber, pulpwood, resources, mixed farming, wheat, ranching, mining, you name it. We've got it. And Canada is in a green trade war. Yes, we are in a green trade war. This is called the tar sands campaign. So a number of big environmental groups banded together to try and shut down the Alberta oil sands. Most of them were foreign funded, some of them were actually foreign groups. And they also incorporated activities with Indigenous people. This is a group called the International Funders for Indigenous People. And you can see that there's kind of a strange mix of organizations associated with it. From that same report, we find that these foreign funders are activating Indigenous groups to take legal action. They're funding them to block the oil sands. In this case, the Cooperators Bank in the UK funded the Beaver Lake Cree Nation, and they were trying to shut down the tar sands, the oil sands. And also one of the people at that same International Funders for Indigenous People conference said that they came off a $15 million case that involved 37 lawyers and 57 law students, and they achieved justice for some Aboriginal people in central British Columbia. We enforced the idea that there cannot be industrial development without an accommodation of the needs of the wildlife upon which the rights depend. That took $15 million, and it took 15 years. This is constitutional law. We can win, but we can get there, and we're struggling. We're inspired by the work that others are doing, and we're not under that tent. We're separate but supportive. It's scary to say to people a $15 million case. I would give up, but I just worked for a Central British Columbia case, and we started without 1 cent, and the donations came in, and we worked hard, and that case sets a precedent for this case. So, of course, people in Canada have a perfect right to take their cases to court, but just imagine what that's costing Canadian citizens, because on the other side of these 57 law students and 37 lawyers, there has to be a bevy of Canadian government lawyers defending the case as well. And, if this money that's supporting these kinds of actions is coming from foreign groups, I think that we should be able to ask questions about that, serious questions. So another part of the foreign-funded campaign was the Rethink Alberta campaign and the blocking of Keystone XL. And this is also from the International Funders for Indigenous People report. That was a 2010 report. So in here they outlined that there would be a number of mostly silent supporters suggesting that it was for their protection. They're expecting a lot of backlash from Alberta. Well, that didn't actually happen at that time. And the campaign's big goal was to end the expansion of the oil sands, and key to that is blocking approval of the $7 billion pipeline review by the U.S. Department of State, which happened when President Biden was elected, immediately after he was elected. This is Susan Casey Lefkowitz. She's with the NRDC out of the United States, and this is from a CBC documentary called The Tipping Point: Age of the Oil Sands from 2011, and she outlines what the tar sands campaign was about to do. The U.S. is the main market, so you go after the market. You go after the market in terms of individual consumers, corporate consumers, investors, policy, infrastructure, and at the regulatory level in Ottawa in terms of climate policy and energy policy. So this is definitely foreign-funded interference in Canada. And there are many environmental non-governmental groups. This is a small one, but it's rather dedicated to Aboriginal issues. For instance, they support the Beaver Lake Cree Nation in its legal action. They support another First Nation in BC and the Teseco mines, gold, copper, blocking. They support the legal costs of unwanted development projects on their territory. And they also support the Wet'suwet'en fundraising in support of the nation's legal action against Coastal GasLink. So this is actually a very small amount of money compared to most of the environmental non-governmental groups. But you can see that this is tax subsidized, it's charity. So even the people who work on Coastal GasLink or up in the oil sands are effectively funding this kind of activity because it's coming from the tax dollars. And foreign-funded environmental groups in Canada have tremendous power. People really don't realize it, but the revenues received by these environmental groups, this would be the top 40 here, and their enviro law counterparts over 2000, the period from 2000 to 2018 was over 18 times the revenues received by all federal political parties, and over 27 times the revenues received by the market-oriented institutes. That would be like Fraser Institute and such like. And the revenue received by Tide's organization alone, it's now called Make Way, is more than the combined revenues of Canada's two largest federal parties, the Liberal Party of Canada and Conservative Party of Canada. So you can see there's an inordinate amount of money sloshing around in these environmental groups, and they all coordinate together. So they're well coordinated, they're well funded, they're professional, they have professional media advice, and they have lots of boots on the ground. For example, there's one group of about 10 charities and 2 nonprofits, or one nonprofit and one umbrella group, called the Strathmere Group. That's their umbrella designation. So in 2014, we planned and facilitated the Toronto Skills Building Workshop, Campaigns and Communications 2014, where directors from Canada's 12 leading environmental organizations learned from leading market researchers, journalists, and organizers, and agreed to work on shared frames and messages in advance of the 2015 federal election. Now, Parker Gallant has done some research on the Strathmere Group, and he found that they have over 358,000 members, 420 staff, and annual budgets totaling over $50 million. So I don't think there's anything illegal about that, but that's certainly a lot of influence. And because some of the money coming into these groups is foreign funding, and we have concerns recently about foreign interference in Canadian affairs, I think questions rightly should be asked. And that was actually what the Alberta inquiry was about, but it was only dedicated to Alberta. So we have a few summaries of some of the reports on our website, on our blog, but I think that we need to pay further attention to these matters, and I'll show you why. So I'm not sure that people know that Canada is a very large exporter of natural gas and also oil. So we're in the top 10 in both. And these are huge revenue generating industries for Canada. This is what funds our healthcare and our education and our infrastructure, our military, our country. It's a very, very significant portion of our revenue, but it's being blocked by all these different activists. So let's go back in time. I'm rather fond of history, and I think when you see things on a timeline, sometimes things make a bit more sense. So something happened in 2005. And this is what Simon Michaud is talking about in this video. This video is about the mineral and metal supply in the world. And he found that something interesting happened in about 2005. Suddenly the prices began to fluctuate quite wildly. And he says that the case can be made that this blowout was a chain reaction started in the oil industry. And then, of course, there was the economic collapse of 2008, and a major economic correction of 2008 did not resolve the problems. So the change started something like 17 years ago in our past. So that would be around 2005. Now, he's talking about the fact that metal prices are kind of a touch point for everything in the world, because everything is manufactured. It needs oil and gas energy and coal energy to be manufactured, but all these mined minerals must find a market at a certain price. and prices started really going up then, indicating that there was something amiss in markets. But also in 2005, for Canadians, the Oak Foundation gave this grant to the Sierra Club, and Elizabeth May was then the executive director. And the purpose of the grant was to provide overall coordination of Canadian NGOs working on climate change in Canada, and to have greenhouse gas emissions classified as pollutants under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, and to create and administer a climate change action fund. So this is why you're paying a carbon tax today, because of this foreign funding in 2005 and the lobbying of this group and these many other coordinated Canadian NGOs. In 2005, by sheer coincidence, I happened to be working in the office of Alberta Environment. And I was a communications officer there, an information officer. So I was responding to public requests about different things that the Alberta government was doing, and a lot of them were related, a lot of the questions were related to the oil sands. So we were very surprised when the Sierra Club put out their Rio report. This relates back to the Rio conference of 1992 in Brazil, because every year they rate people and companies and such like, and provinces in this case, as to how they're doing. So we were very surprised because we had a very good program in place to manage environment and address climate change concerns. We were like the first jurisdiction in North America to have such a program. And it was quite comprehensive. So, we were shocked when we got this low score, like we got an F. So we got failing grades in all categories. And Ontario got a B+. So, we were in shock at the office, and we didn't realize what was going on. Nobody knew there was a tar sands campaign. Nobody knew there was this coordinated activity in the background. But what else happened in 2005? Well, the United Nations Principle for Responsible Investment was formed. And today, climate change is their main thing, and ESG. Now, what's the UNPRI? Well, it is it's an organization of about 1,000 institutional investors and pension funds, and combined they sit on somewhere between 90 to 100 trillion dollars in assets under management. So this is a transnational, unelected, unaccountable organization, and you can imagine that they have tremendous power with that much money behind them. And who's their fiduciary guru? Well, of course, it's Mr. Gore. Now, Al Gore's Generation Investment Management was formed in 2004. And most people in Alberta and Saskatchewan will know that Mr. Gore has been cheering on the blocking of Kinder Morgan TMX. So these are the roots of ESG. That's environment, social, and governance. And it comes from the UNPRI. And you can see they have 6 principles. They're trying to include ESG in everything they do. And they also have a requirement to comply or explain. So even though it's a voluntary organization, once you're in, it's kind of like being within, I don't know, I guess you could say within a clique or within a gang where, you must comply. And Generation Investment Management also claims to have played a pioneering role in the development of sustainable and environmental, social, and governance investing. And of course, Mr. Gore's film came out in 2006, and he won the Nobel Prize in 2007. Now, interestingly enough, in light of recent events in the world, in 2006, the World Economic Forum published its global risks report, and the two things they highlighted as a serious risk to the future were a potential oil price shock and how dramatically that would affect the world if the price went between 100 to or 80 to $100 per barrel, or an influenza pandemic. Now, by 2020, both of these had been taken out of their global risk report and replaced by climate change. Now, just imagine if these had been kept in there and if world leaders had been cognizant of these as risks, but they somehow vanished, and then they both happened in the space of a couple of years. Curious. Climate Works Foundation was formed in 2008. So this is an organization of, I don't know, about 14 major philanthropies, most of them in the States, but some not. Some are like the Oak Foundation that I mentioned before in Switzerland. And they fund particular causes. And they developed this plan back then in conjunction with the consulting firm McKinsey called Design to Win. And the plan was to fund local environmental, non-governmental groups around the world to make it appear as if they were presenting a grassroots demand for policy change, and yet the policies would support the things that this group wanted to push, like renewable energy, EVs, sustainable agriculture, land use, limit or oppose fossil fuel industry. So this was a very coordinated campaign, and of course it is many of the people who are, or many of the groups who are part of this are associated with the tar sands campaign funding. Now, another thing happened in 2005. There was a big conference by a number of scientists because the GHG theory of AGW was failing. So that means that the radiated forcing theory of climate change, that carbon dioxide and its concentration is what drives warming, was not bearing out. Like over the years, it wasn't showing that actually a rising concentration of carbon dioxide was warming the planet. And in fact, in 2006, Bob Carter, who was a scientist from Australia, wrote this article that actually got published in the Telegraph saying there is a problem with global warming. It stopped in 1998. So I'm sure many of you have never ever heard that. So these are two important books. Now, just based on what I just told you about the UNPRI and the institutional investments and pension funds, these are two important books to give you a certain sense that there are very big powers in the world now that are no longer related to national governments. And so let's just have a peek here. The Unseen Revolution was by Peter Drucker. It was written in the 1970s, and he foresaw that basically pension fund socialism would come to America, meaning that the pension funds of corporations would be richer than the corporations. And to some extent that became true. And then these mutual funds, where many of those pension funds are invested, they also became a powerhouse. But the problem with Drucker's vision, like at first he thought it would be a good thing, but actually it turned out that the powers that be in many of these pension funds became more interested in shareholder value and less interested in the actual workers they represented. So they got busy moving industry offshore, which decimated much of the North American and some of the European workforce and industry, because everything moved to mostly to China, but some to India. But and so once that happened, you can imagine that on the upside for China, there was a big investment there. On the downside, the West kind of put all its money into a country that doesn't operate by the same rules that the West does. And so I believe the green trade war is in progress, and I think it's a brilliant concept. I mean, kudos to China. They're very smart. And supreme excellence consists of breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. So let's just have a look economically at how things have gone along. See, there wasn't a great deal of investment or growth in China initially. In 1992, that was when the Rio conference happened. And at that time, it was agreed that China was a developing nation. And so they didn't have the same climate change obligations as the rest of the world. So especially the developed world. And by 2001, China entered into the WTO, World Trade Organization. But again, because it was deemed to be a developing nation, they got kind of special privileges. And Apple began operations in China about that time. So now suddenly see what happens. There's a dramatic growth in GDP, right? And in 2015, Made in China was the plan that was developed. That was Made in China 2025. So I'll be talking about that in a minute. That was developed then, and that was also the year of the Paris Agreement. So Made in China 2025, and that's only a couple of years away now. This is where China wants to be the world leader in all of these and have world dominance in all of these markets, enterprises, strategies, and talents in these 10 key sectors: new information technology, numerical control tools, aerospace, high-tech ships, railway equipment, energy saving, new materials, medical devices, agricultural machinery, and power equipment. Now, that's great for China. They have a very optimistic and aggressive outlook on the future for them, but the rest of the world is a little freaked out about it, in part because when people have gone to China to do business, or when China has invested in the West, there's always these forced transfer agreements. So foreign companies complain that to invest or do business in China, they must enter into joint ventures with Chinese firms under terms that require them to share sensitive intellectual property and advanced technological know-how. So this fellow says that China has used its joint venture rules to acquire outside technologies ranging from high-speed rail to electric vehicle batteries. And some of these rules relating to automakers have since been relaxed. And so if you're going to go into all those industries, of course, you're going to need lots of minerals, and you're also going to need access to world markets to deliver produced products. So this is a map from Visual Capitalist, which shows China's penetration into different places around the world. And also, you may have heard of the Belt and Road Initiative. And this was a plan of China's to build overland roads, kind of like the Silk Road of ancient times. So to build overland roads and rails, and also to have maritime ports. And so a lot of countries invested in that or agreed to that. I think more than 140 countries have agreed to that. And a lot of this is financed by the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is an alternative to the World Bank, and which operates somewhat differently. And for Canadians, of course, you may be aware that the World Bank, at one point, I don't know if it's still true, but they had stopped working with SNC-Lavalin because of various corruption charges. So the Asian Infrastructure Bank offered them another window of opportunity for work around the world. So this is a webinar from the organization in the United States called Committee on the Present Danger, China. And they're very concerned about infiltration of China and influence of China in North America and certainly in Canada. And in that presentation, this fellow who was with CSIS, Michel Junot Katsuya, says that we have been infiltrated by agents of influence. There's another fellow that talks in the webinar about a hybrid war in America's backyard. Well, we're America's backyard. So the Canadian Mosaic is actually one of our greatest strengths, but it's also one of our weaknesses. So this map shows First Nation status in Canada. And if you know about a popular strategy game in Asia, it's called Go. So it's a strategic board game based on territorial acquisition. So keep that in mind as we look at the maps. Now, people might think the furor about Chinese allegations of Chinese interference in Canadian electoral affairs is only recent, but this goes back to 1971. This is from the Globe and Mail. It talks about that there were Chinese spies who spirited away Canadian nuclear technology. Well, I didn't know about that. But probably everybody knows about this. A couple of years ago, the Kamloops band made a finding or a discovery with ground-penetrating radar, which is a kind of method of low-grade seismic or something you might call it, or I guess you might compare it to sort of ultrasound. So they made a finding and claimed that they had found 215 unmarked graves. And this quickly escalated from unmarked graves, possible unmarked graves, to mass graves, to claims of genocide against Canada. And Terry Glavin is a journalist who's worked extensively with First Nations people, and he's written a number of books about different First Nations groups. And he's also a journalist who's worked boots on the ground around the world, including in China. So he was the one who picked up on a curious thing about this story, that if you remember, our flag was down for like half a year, had half-mast. There was a great deal of outcry. People were shocked and horrified. Media around the world picked up the story. But toward the end of this story by Terry Glavin, he says the bigger picture scheme of things, 3 weeks after the Kamloops story broke, China led a bloc of torture states that included Belarus, Russia, Iran, Syria, and North Korea in a condemnation of Canada's treatment of Indigenous peoples. Beijing's move preempted a Canadian initiative 3 years in the making, assembling a coalition of countries to force the United Nations to investigate China's trampling of human rights in Xinjiang. So that's in relation to the Uyghur people. So China accuses Canada of genocide at the UN. They said, we're deeply concerned about the serious human rights violations against Indigenous people in Canada. They claim that historically Canada robbed the Indigenous people of the land, killed them, and eradicated their culture. They also call for a thorough and impartial investigation into all cases where crimes were committed against Indigenous people, especially the children. And he cited the preliminary discovery last month of what are thought to be unmarked burial sites of children's remains adjacent to the former Kamloops residential school. And he delivered his statement on behalf of a group of countries that included Russia, Belarus, Iran, North Korea, Syria, and Venezuela. Now, I'm sure that most people don't know, but actually last fall, the House of Commons declared Indian residential schools program as genocide. Now that's pretty bizarre because in the Great Leap Forward in China, the country killed about 36 million of their own people. And that estimated 36 million Chinese men, women, and children starved to death during China's Great Leap Forward in the late 50s and early 60s. There's an author, Yang Zhisheng, who spent 20 years piecing together the events, and he found no natural causes and attributes the responsibility to China's totalitarian system. And this is the book that he wrote, called Tombstone. China's democide is rooted in cancel culture. This is the very interesting thing, because we find all across the West now, people cannot seem to have open civil debate on any issue. And you find in this book that people were always subjected to struggle if they didn't go along with the party line. And things like the grand achievements were attributed to struggle against rate-deviating conservatism. In an atmosphere of extreme political pressure, anyone who dared question the accuracy of these reported crop yields risked being labeled a doubter or denier and engaged in casting aspersions on the excellent situation. Anyone who exposed the fraudulence of the high-yield model was subjected to struggle. So, struggle, as described in that book, is that the dissenting individual would be put in a circle of loyal partisans who would then push and shove the person around and shout at them. Maybe they'd fall down, they'd kick them, beat them, until the person complied. So they would try and force people to comply or be beaten and perhaps die. And we see that going on now in public life, where anyone who raises a question about any topic that is not on whatever the party line is gets attacked, either verbally or actually physically sometimes. So, that's very interesting that that's happening now in the West. But let's be clear, while Canada was providing education, food, clothing, and skills to Indigenous children, China was starving millions of its own people. TB, tuberculosis, was the biggest killer of all Canadians until the 1950s. And some Indian residential school facts. Education was offered in the treaties, and chiefs and councils requested education, particularly skills training like literacy, agriculture, industry, medical, and clerical. Parents had to register their children to attend. Schooling was not mandatory until 1920, in keeping with truancy laws, in off reserve. Detailed death certificates were issued if TB, disease, or injury caused a death. Some children were orphans with no one else to help them and nowhere else to go. So they actually lived at the residential school. Some of them lived there their entire life. And residential schools served as the regional social services medical hub in the early days. And just to be clear, in 1908, 1 Canadian died every hour of the day, and 2 Canadians died every hour of the night of tuberculosis. So it really was a brutal killer. Now, in a very kind of curious set of circumstances, it turns out that I happen to have done a series of 41 half-hour historical shows in the 1980s, and my research supervisor was Dr. Hugh Dempsey of the Glenbow Museum in Calgary. And Dr. Dempsey was married to Pauline Gladstone, the daughter of Senator Gladstone. And no one ever mentioned any kind of genocide to me. And Pauline Gladstone Dempsey has an article online about her experience in residential school. And she did have some concerns and it's very difficult to be in a boarding school of any kind. And it was a very difficult time of transition because the world was changing extremely rapidly. But overall, her comments are quite supportive of the system, and she learned many skills which she recounts. And there's quite a few of these testimonies out there. These are the ones we never hear about. But Dr. Dempsey never mentioned any such genocide to me. What he mentioned is that in the Cypress Hills, the Assiniboine tribe were massacred by the Benton gang, which came from the United States. They came over the border, massacred the Benton gang, and this is why Sir John A. Macdonald sent the RCMP. They were then known as the Northwest Mounted Police. That's why he sent them west, to stop that kind of border incursion, to stop the whiskey traders who were really just destroying the lives of the Plains people. And so I think that Canadians have to look at their own history a bit more carefully and not just read these gruesome headlines and accept what's being said. So those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. Now, why and how does this relate to the rare metals war? Well, there's quite a movement for land back reconciliation. And in the UN, the whole biodiversity groups are saying, well, Indigenous territories constitute 20% of the Earth's land mass, but that harbors 80% of Earth's remaining biodiversity. And so the theme is that there is superior knowledge in Indigenous groups to care for the Earth. Now, just to get a sense of what's going on here, this is a map of all of the numbered treaties that were made in Canada in the early times. And people who are not familiar with Canadian history, there was peaceful trading going on in Canada for a couple of hundred years. But in the United States, they had a very violent history. They were running Indian wars from 1622 to 1924. And, some historians summarize U.S. history as they built the saloon and then Boot Hill. And Canadian history, they built the mission and then the Mountie outpost. So it was a very different history in Canada. And voila! Well, here we are at the Rare Metals War. Canada is just full of all the special, unique, rare metals that someone would need to be manufacturing all of the things for the world by 2025. And, well, look at that overlap. You can see why people might want to cozy up to First Nations groups. And here we have some additional input from the David Suzuki Foundation advocating for governance back and shared governance. So let's just have a quick look at exploration and oil and gas production. So this is a map of the top 100 exploration projects, and this one notes oil and gas production areas, and note that the oil and gas rights conflict with marine protected areas. And who should consult with who for resource development, the province or the treaty area bands? So here's a top 100 mining activities overlaying on the treaty areas and the marine protected areas. And the orange is the new treaties. And here are the top 100 mining areas overlaying on conservation areas and parks. So is Canada becoming a big park? So here's the conservation land areas. And you can see that it's pretty significant. So whoever influences the Indigenous narrative wins. So this is a map of Inuit and First Nations point locations with 100 top exploration projects. And these are not treaty areas, but these areas the First Nations deem to be their original lands. And there's another thing that you may not have heard of called Indigenous Protected Areas Project. And the red dots represent the location of Indigenous communities in Canada. The dark blue represents intact ecological areas, and the light blue represents intact forest layer. And you can see that there is activity here for Indigenous Leadership Initiative. Indigenous protected and conserved areas are more than just lines on a map. They protect places that matter most and support healthy lands, which builds healthy communities. They're an expression of nationhood, and we're proud to support this work across Canada. And of course, there's also a National Marine Conservation Area system. So Canada has almost no seaports. And if these kinds of plans continue, will we have any? So there's a movement for land guardians so that Aboriginal people would be reducing the threats of climate change by lands managed by Indigenous people are healthier and more vibrant. So they're asking people to join the Land Needs Guardian movement, calling for more Indigenous-led stewardship to create a better world for everyone. Of course, about half of the Indigenous people of Canada live in urban areas. Another element that is part of this mix is that in COP27 it included a loss and damage clause. And Indigenous people have long argued that they have done little to contribute to climate change, but they're most affected, and they're expected to make steep sacrifices to fix it. Funding for green energy projects continues to skyrocket. Despite clear and growing threats to Indigenous people's lands and rights, Indigenous leaders persistently express concern over global conservation programs that remove communities from their traditional territories, while record numbers of environmental, Indigenous, and land defenders are killed. So now let's talk a little bit about the coming demographic shifts. And I recommend that people read Peter Zahan's book. It's really amazing, mind-blowing, scary. But, life goes on. We just have to press on no matter what comes toward us. But it's better if we're informed, I think, than we can make plan B. So one of the realities is that by 2030, the last of the boomers will enter retirement. And by 2050, the last of the boomers will pass on. So boomers like me, we used to be 22% of the population in Canada. So that's a pretty big chunk that's going to be vanishing from the workforce and also just from the population. And geopolitical power has shifted. So the BRICS have the upper hand and are gaining allies. So that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So none of these nations care about climate change. Let's be frank. In a BRICS world, Canada is ever more isolated, and the security shield of the US that we used to rely on is pretty much compromised. And the BRICS aren't going to surpass G7 in their share of global economic growth. So it's an economic powerhouse now. Meanwhile, climate change policies are destroying Canada. So Canada's GHG emissions are 1.6% of the global total. And our emissions have risen, global emissions have risen 60% since 1990 and continue to do so. But the population and economic growth in Asia is driving the emissions growth. North America and the EU combined are only 15% of the world's population. See? So nothing we do on climate change is going to make a difference because we're just too small of an element. And China emits in 1 month what Canada emits in a year and a half. So even if we vanished, it wouldn't make a difference. And remember how Alberta phased out coal to save the planet? Well, this is the kind of coal consumption that there is in China. And here's our contributions to global warming. If the world warming is 1 degree over the past century, Celsius, 1 degree Celsius, the Canadian contribution is 0.019, or Alberta's contribution is 0.006, or 6 thousandths of a degree. Now, see, the situation is quite complicated because many of the pension funds have invested in China. So, and this is from 2019. So you can imagine that this is ever more complicated now. And yet, Canada's demographic crisis threatens incomes and living standards. So in Canada, the ratio of people 65 and older to the people 15 to 64, which is called the dependency ratio, is projected to increase by more than 20% over the next 2 decades. And in Calvin Halen's demographic Dances with Dependency, he talks about the demographic tsunami of the growing Aboriginal youth and all of the obligations to meet both Métis and Aboriginal demands, and how there's a declining tax pool because all of the boomers are vanishing and leaving the workforce. Meanwhile, Indigenous programs and payouts actually also help drive federal deficits. So Indigenous spending in total fiscal 2021 to 22 was about $25 billion compared to more than $29 billion in 23-24. So that's an increase of $4 billion in just 2 fiscal years. To put things in proportion, that $4 billion growth is equal to 40% of the estimated increase in the overall deficit booked in the past 5 months. So now we have to face the fact that Xi Jinping says China is to become dominant world power within 30 years. So when we think of things like net zero 2030, well, you know, China's planning on being the manufacturing center of the world by 2025, and think of net zero 2050, well, they're planning to be the world superpower by 2049. And the quote is, "We now march in confident strides toward the second 100-year goal of building China into a great modern socialist country in all respects." So we have to ask, I think, is foreign interference in Canada related to violent Aboriginal activism? Maybe you remember before the COVID lockdowns, we had about 2 months of blockadia in the Shut Down Canada movement. And this was dotted all across the country. And there was a lot of social media activity. And you know, people were fairly upset in Ottawa about the Freedom Convoy, but there was never an emergency order issued, right? The Emergency Act was never invoked. There were 6 weeks of blocked rail lines, 60 plus ships waiting, unloading at both east and west coasts, sabotage, fires, thousands laid off, food necessity shortages. CN sued for $270 million. It was dropped, and property was damaged. But there was no Emergency Act invoked. And here we are with Bill McKibben again. So 350 Canada said exactly 1 year ago today, Canada's freedom called it, shut down Canada. Native people could shut down this whole country because all the transportation corridors go through our lands. It's always been about these transportation corridors to get stolen goods off our lands. And so a decade ago, founder Bill McKibben described 350org as a scruffy little outfit. It's grown into a major international force in the movement against climate change. Now this was advocating for Power Shift in 2019, which was an activist training session for this kind of shutdown. And here's who sponsored the Power Shift, David Suzuki Foundation, Greenpeace, Wilderness Committee, Sierra Club Canada, Council of Canadians, the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, National Union of Public and General Employees, and Unifor. So you may not know it, but we just had a visit from the UN Special Rapporteur, and he called it an appalling legacy of residential schools tops the UN Indigenous Rights Rapporteur's early findings. So what would the reparations be for this alleged genocide? Land back? Money? Or will we have another shut down Canada? Again, we should go back and have a look at what the people at CSIS had to say. We've been infiltrated by agents of influence. So Canada is really in the crosshairs of geopolitics. And that's the presentation for today. So I would like to thank you for joining and watching. I hope it gave you some food for thought. I think that we're in pretty serious trouble, and I don't think that we have anyone who will come to our aid, really, because everyone in the world, all the countries of the world, are facing trouble with their economies, with the conflicts between Ukraine and Russia, and that invasion there. So I'm not sure if people are aware of these issues related to the land back movement and related to the rare metals. Now, you know, it's interesting to note that we've got all these conservation areas in Canada, and yet those are also where all the rare metals are. And there's a fellow on Twitter, I'm just mentioning Twitter because it's very easy for people to see. They don't have to read a book. His name is John Lee Pettimore. He's a retired mining mechanic, and he shows all these enormous mining industry equipment, you know, with little tiny people standing beside it, that these pieces of equipment they guzzle oil, gas, and coal every day, and they rip the earth apart. So that's how we get our things, everything that we have, whether it's your cell phone or whatever you have. It's made from mined materials, or it's grown in a field or a forest. So that's it. That's how we get our stuff. So if people think that having these conservation areas will keep them away from predatory forces, like, say, a country that wants to be the world's factory by 2025, I think you're sadly mistaken. I hope that you'll have a look at the books that I suggested, and then that might give you a better idea of what's coming down the line. Anyway, on a slightly more optimistic note, I think that sharing this kind of information and opening up the discussion is really important. And that's what we do at Friends of Science. We're entering our 21st year of operation. We're a small nonprofit. We're not funded by government, and we're not funded by big oil. We're funded by our members. Most of our contributions are under $100, and we'd be very happy if you would help us with a small donation. So since it's our 21st year, $21 would be great. So you could send that by e-transfer, or you can send a larger donation online, or you can phone the office. And if you don't want to use your card online, you can join us and become a member. Then you'll get our newsletters, and you'll help our cause. So again, I just want to thank you for listening in, and I hope that it put a few things in perspective for you, maybe stimulated more questions than it gave you answers, and that's probably a good thing too. Anyway, for Friends of Science Society, thank you. I'm Michelle Sterling.